Mondays with Mike is a podcast by two friends from the Seattle area. Originally intended as a news analysis podcast, as of spring 2025, it has lately mostly covered current events. Show notes can be found at mondayswithmike.ddns.net. Mondays with Mike is your weekly helping of opinion and critical analysis of the day's news. Bud asks the questions, and Mike supplies the takes. Start a social revolution. Make friends with your neighbor. Disagree without being disagreeable. And remember, if it's Mondays, it's with Mike. So on Thursday, we saw that there was a trade deal between the US and the UK struck. Stock market likes it. It's important to note that the UK, while it is a major trading partner of the US, and it is a substantial economy, it's not a bloc, it's a nation that stands on its own from the EU. So what do we think of this deal? And specifically, does it demonstrate that people actually, even the signatories of the deal, what they really want is mostly free trade with a 10% baseline? Is that going to be the new normal now?
It's not really free trade if there's a tariff, in the sense that the UK isn't imposing a tariff in response to what we're doing. But yes, it sure looks like countries just want to get back to business as usual, selling to the huge US market and making money. And any increase in trade from the UK to the US can be chalked up as a win for Trump, because the whole point was to say, look, we just need to get countries to start buying more of US everything. Anything and everything that US is selling, they just need to start buying more of it. Any indication in this trade deal that they're doing that, which they are, is a win for Trump. So that's what it looks like. As long as he can send out that good signaling, that good messaging, that's the way it goes. Where it becomes a difficult issue is for countries that don't want to play ball, right? So China is the one we're seeing right now that isn't responding. I guess they're having that meeting, but still it's non-responsive in terms of the pressure campaign that they're trying to put on, because the damage is already done. The supply chain's already disrupted. The ships are already showing up half empty. That's not good. The one thing I know for trade deals is that trade deals sometimes have a political element to them, that countries are trying to accomplish different goals other than just trade, that they're also trying to accomplish their geopolitical goals. For example, India swooped in when China turned away the Boeing planes. Hey, we'll buy your planes. Let us buy all the Boeing planes. We want them. And that's because they want to, upgrade their air infrastructure, their airline industry, a whole bunch of other reasons. But there are geopolitical reasons to trade deals other than just free trade or tariffs.
Okay. We were going to talk about this later in the show, but it dovetails nicely into this, is that the Port of Seattle is not getting the kind of shipping that we would expect.
All the ports, Port of Los Angeles, Port Long Beach, we're going to see it probably for the East Coast. If you look at the real-time data of what's called the blank sailing, where the ships are just sailing empty, it's up, right? There's empty ships, which is not a good sign.
So I've never stockpiled toilet paper before, but if we were gonna expect shortages on something, what will it be? Does anybody know?
Yeah, the list is pretty extensive, but the big ones are toys, furniture, electronic equipment. So if you need any kind of stereo or anything that has to do with electronics, that's a big deal. But the big one is furniture, and then clothing. A huge amount of clothing is imported from China. A significant, substantive portion of the clothing market is all directly imported from China. But I don't know. I was looking through the list of all the exports that China does to the US, and it's a pretty extensive list, but the shortages are going to be for anything that cannot currently be manufactured anywhere outside of China. The big one, in terms of what will matter directly to people in a very immediate way, is antibiotics. So China has 90% of the world's inputs for antibiotics, the ingredients to make antibiotics. They make half of all antibiotics that are sold to the world, right? So that's going to have an immediate effect in terms of shortages of people going to the hospital, and there's not enough medicine. That's a big deal because it's not so clear that there's just a viable alternative that's just going to suddenly replace 90% of the world's inputs for medicine. That's not a good situation. Medical
No.
devices, right? The list is very long. But yes, you mentioned toilet paper. That's not so much of an issue, right? Because toilet paper is made from tree pulp and stuff that we can get from Canada, the U.S. That one's not so much of an issue. But the shortages on clothing, right? If you want new clothing, there's a whole list of it. Everyday items that you may not expect are definitely going to be affected because the inputs to those items come from China. So the raw ingredients and materials to make those items. And so that we're going to see it.
Does this include rare earths?
Yeah, it does. But where you see that is going to be in the end products, right? And that's on the big ticket items. Rare earths, where you see that is stuff like military planes and drones and all sorts of things that the regular consumer usually doesn't buy. But the things that consumers do buy are computers and iPhones, all the new
Mm-hmm.
generations of iPhones, the Nintendo Switch. That was a big one.
Mm-hmm.
All the consoles. It looks like console prices for video games are going to skyrocket significantly. Video games themselves, the cartridges, they're going to go up if you want a physical copy of the video game instead of a digital copy of the video game. That's a big deal. Some people like collecting video games because they accrue in value, like art.
Cool. Well, and while we're on the trade topic, we might as well just jump right into the Trump Carney meeting. Some slight media analysis beforehand. I watched the video of at least their public meeting. It was described as tense. I don't know, I would call it tense. It wasn't, they weren't on the same page.
It's the
Go ahead,
body
please.
language. So the reason I say it was tense is that every time Trump mentioned the 51st state stuff or tried to open the door on it even being a possibility, Carney just shut him down. Just like, Canada is not for sale. There was a giant election. The Canadian people have spoken. It's
Mm-hmm.
not happening. And the language was very unusual for these kinds of press conferences. If you pay attention to how they reminded me of the Zelensky meeting where they're like, oh, you don't have the cards, you don't have the cards, is that
Yeah.
Carney was not looking happy for some of the things that Trump was saying. And even though he spoke a good game and he said the things that you expect to hear, what wasn't being said in the body language was pretty unhappy. But that's just the way it goes. The situation is a little tense right now between the US
Mm-hmm.
and Canada for trade, for any number of issues. We're not going to stop being friends because we share that giant border and we need them and they need us. They need us more than we need them. We're
Mm-hmm.
75% of Canada's export economy. So
Yeah.
they need to sell stuff to us or their economy goes in a really unfortunate direction. So yeah, they
Mm-hmm.
need us.
Yeah.
But countries aren't happy when they need another country because the world is unpredictable and leaders can be unpredictable. And it gives a certain degree of leverage over those countries, which we're seeing play out right now in terms of how the situation's unfolding in these conversations. I saw the meeting. It was okay. It was better than Trudeau and Trump, if only because Carney's less of a fixed palette of colors of responses for how Trump feels about him, that he's more of a blank slate, that the
Mm-hmm.
relationship is less tested because Trudeau was around for Trump's first administration. They had disagreements, and those disagreements played out publicly in a way that isn't happening right now between Carney and Trump.
Carney strikes me as an extremely competent fellow. His reputation precedes him. He was head of the Bank of England and in a lot of just very impressive jobs over his life. And of course, we discussed previously that there is the possibility that when he first got into office, he talked with people behind the scenes, and this is just speculative, but he might have said, if we're under siege by the United States, dumping the bonds is a good way of doing that. Now, did he do that? Did he not do that? He would have had the expertise to do it, given his experience at the Bank of England. But whether or not that happens, he strikes me as a very serious and no nonsense leader. And some of his speeches are, I can't quote, but it's, we're going to have to prepare for a very painful and very needed separation from the United States. So I think that they are ready to endure much hardship if necessary. And right now, just based on the talk, it's like they're not on best terms, but they're not at each other's throats. They're not at each other's throats. But I think they would be prepared to do a lot, including become an ally of China if they needed to. And I just think how awful it would be if, just based on sheer bluster, Trump drove our closest ally, closest geographically ally, and almost closest in terms of affection or whatever, into the hands of China. I assess Mark Carney as pretty capable. What do you think?
Oh, I think he's very capable. It's Machiavellian the way that if he did orchestrate the bond sell-off, that he found the pressure point for how Trump would actually back off if all the warning signs started flashing red in the market. That because he knows how the levers of power work, where the real money is and where it comes from, and how it functions for sovereign wealth and spending because of his role as a central banker, that he's got a very nuanced understanding of where exactly you can actually make meaningful, significant change from a geopolitical perspective. And I think that's part of the sort of deftness, which is how he's weaving through this moment in time. But you're right that Canada could turn towards China for at least one market, which is potash, because the US is one of the biggest purchasers of potash for farming, but China, the number two, right? Or actually, they might even be number one, but the demand is very high. And China, one of the world's largest purchasers of potash, which is a necessary thing for fertilizer. It's to grow crops. It's a big deal for China. But no, I think that Carney's very smart, clearly a good political operator, even though he's never really run for anything of significance. He's always been like appointed or applied for a job and always worked in a career government kind of capacity when you're working. Actually, I don't even know if you'd call it career government. It's more, it's difficult to define it because the Bank of England is, yes, like government, but it's a bank, right? Like it's a little complicated. It's the same deal with the Federal Reserve and the chairman and the board, that they're a quasi governmental entity, but they're banks, right? Like they're just banks that happen to set monetary policy within the United States. But the big difference is that banks get like special loans from the government at very low interest rates and then get, that's a whole different conversation. But in terms of Mark Carney in the future, my concern is still this boycott that's happening. It's not so clear the boycott stopped of Canadians not traveling to the US for tourism, and also with the boycott on US goods. So the real test for this relationship is if that stops. And I'm not so sure that's going to stop until Trump just completely stops with the 51st state stuff and joking about the prime minister being a governor, because for them it's an existential thing. Canada wants their own separate sovereign identity. They want their universal health care, they want their gun control, they want certain political realities in Canada that are significantly different than the US. It very honestly, I don't see how Canadians would be okay with giving up their universal healthcare at all. Because the United
Yeah.
States healthcare system, it's very clear that it's exceedingly expensive to exist in the United States unless you're, there's exceptions. If you're part of the military, TRICARE is pretty good. If you're part of the government, some of the government insurance is pretty good. But the fact that insurers have the ability to deny care to anyone in any capacity when they need it is a significant difference than what in Canada and a lot of these other countries that have a universal healthcare system. Because the way a universal healthcare system works is that the leverage is that medical providers can't operate in the market if they don't play ball, if they don't agree to what the universal coverage is, the insurer. And because our system is this like patchwork mosaic of different competing insurers and a sort of
Mm-hmm.
public private competition, there is no universal leverage that they can play them off against you. There's a whole different, it's more than just money, right? There's a whole philosophical difference going on about morality, about quality of life, that Trump just seems
Mm.
to be missing. And every time Trump says, "Oh, your healthcare is going to be great, your taxes are going to
Yeah,
be
right.
lower," it's no, no. High insurance premiums are a kind of tax on people that are separate from the taxes they pay on income, on sales, on consumption. The number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States that people cite is healthcare costs. That they needed something, got some kind of
Yeah.
disease they couldn't cure, cancer or something else, and they couldn't pay. They couldn't pay the full freight, the full cost, and so you have to declare bankruptcy. You don't see that in
Mhm.
Canada. You don't see
Definitely
that
not.
in most countries that have a universal system. I think they're going to resist mightily any
Mhm.
effort to integrate with the United States ever until the situation improves politically, because the political situation and the partisanship in the United States is just so contentious that it's difficult to get anything done. That works nicely for the topic we're going to talk about of air traffic control.
We can move to that in a sec. First, I want to applaud Mike here for being correct about the fact that Trump's overtures to Trudeau as governor did not, in fact, make Trudeau look weak, or at least not so much as they united that country. So, well done, Mike. And I think that it is pretty well established, has been pretty well demonstrated by that election, that if they're willing to put their differences with the Liberal Party aside, because that party was going to be doomed. I don't know doomed permanently, but it looked like it might be doomed. It's not doomed anymore.
So I think the
And Trump.
problem actually was Trudeau for why the
Okay.
Liberal Party was losing so much is that it actually was a very much Trudeau-centered issue of sort of stagnant policies, that they didn't do enough to address housing costs. There's a whole list of things for why Trudeau
Mhm.
specifically was unpopular. But by getting Carney in there to replace Trudeau and Trudeau resigning, signaled that message to everyone, like, we're serious, we hear you,
Yes, precisely.
we're gonna move in a completely different direction. Here's this very serious banker dude who's steely
Mhm.
eyed in the face of economic calamity, who understands money. And clearly, our issue right now is trade and money and the economy. And so we need somebody who's just, lives in the numbers, who just
Yeah.
stares at numbers all day and can work magic
Yeah.
with them, can figure out a way to make it all manifest into something that is meaningfully good for Canada instead of like flailing about and suffering.
Trudeau, his father was a very influential prime minister, and he was a man well suited to the world of 2015. And good looking gentleman, popular partially because of that, partially because of he was very up on the talking points of 2015.
Yes, it is
Yeah.
clear that he was the face of Canada on the world stage. He was the one who showed up
Mhm.
to all the stuff. He's the one who did all the things, right? Like, he's the one who talked to all the world leaders. But Canada
Yeah.
is super complicated because we got the different provincial systems that there's a lot more power invested in each of the heads of the provinces compared to the United States. That's why you had Ford in Ontario who was
Mhm.
doing all those like really extreme kinds of tariffs on his own, where he was going to cut off all electricity to I think it was
Minnesota.
3 states. But the whole point
Mhm.
is that he had a degree of latitude that you wouldn't necessarily see as much in the United States in terms of
Mhm.
the powers he could wield. It's a little complicated for how Canada works too, because they get permission from the royal family in the UK. There's a whole different office just for essentially affirming the prime minister in Canada. There's a different political position that's appointed. Anyways, there's a picture of Trudeau being sad with the person that he had to give the resignation to. Is the point I'm making?
Mhm.
There's no one like that in the United States. There's no
Yeah.
noblesse oblige.
So just really quick, I think that it's pretty much settled in the minds of most people, but not Trump, the idea of Canada as the 51st state, because they're willing to go. They're willing to go to a lot of ends to avoid that. And I would also say I've bemoaned the wild swing nature of the American political system before, but today I just take a simpler editorial stance and wish to assure Canadians that they've got a lot of friends in the United States as well. And I think that a lot of people, and I'm not talking in terms of allegiance here, I'm not talking about allegiance, I'm talking about how they would identify. Like, you can see somebody who might have a lot of English heritage, but they don't, like, care about it at all. They're like, I'm Irish. But really, it's like one of their great-grandfathers was Irish or something. But that's what they identify with. And I think a lot of residents of the United States, yeah, they're American, but they think, I'm part of I'm really like a citizen of the world, like I'm really a part of this grand project of the enfranchising and empowering of the people of the world, begun World War II and afterward. But I think a lot of them, that's what excites them, and so I would say that it's not that Canadians have nothing to fear from anybody, but they should know. They should know that a lot of Americans, particularly Americans in blue states, would be very much on their side if worst came to worst in terms of the 51st state debacle. And I'm just talking about identifying with there. I'm not talking about allegiance.
No, if it's put to a vote, I think a lot of the blue states would not agree at all to Canada being forced to be a 51st state, or even this effort to try and pressure them into it through economic, I don't know what you'd call it, a pressure campaign. It's very clear that there's a difference of opinion about things like human rights, the small L liberalism of the world order, of respecting sovereignty and respecting political diversity, if you will, that there is right now at least a bit of a departure in the current Republican Party from respecting like basic sovereignty of countries. You see this playing out with all the rhetoric about the Panama Canal, about Greenland, about Trump's plan to displace people from Gaza or ask them to leave at the end of a gun. Like there's a whole list of issues where you don't see the Republican Party and their leadership talking out against something in a way that is different from how it's been before. There was a time where the Republican Party actually was pretty committed to respect for sovereignty. And also, the big one is the push for democracy. So there was a time in my lifetime that there was a unanimity of belief between both Democrats and Republicans that it was good if countries were trying to form democracies, and it was bad if they're going towards authoritarianism. There has been a real departure in that sense. Because remember, there was a time where George W. Bush was like, oh, look at the axis of evil, the different countries, but also would talk about let's not work with dictators and tyrannical countries and authoritarian countries. Let's not make deals with North Korea and all these other things. But what you're seeing right now with Trump is a serious departure from that. Trying to send people to Libya, a country in a civil war, trying to send people to El Salvador, a country that is currently in a declared state of emergency, where Bukele self-described himself as the world's coolest dictator, where they've placed thousands of people in prison for life in the pursuit of reducing the homicide rate. I get it. I understand the argument for why they're doing it. But the problem is that's a serious departure from the beliefs that the U.S. has propagated throughout the world about human rights. Remember, U.S. was the one who led the Nuremberg trials, right? Established the Nuremberg principle of never again, right? Just following orders isn't sufficient. There has to be some moral foundation to how everyone acts, even in war, even in times of extreme danger, that you can't just like wholesale slaughter people. You can't blockade them and force everyone to starve to death. There's a whole list of things that countries shouldn't and must not do, and that all countries have a responsibility to say no. That was the whole idea behind the formation of the UN and the UN
Mm-hmm.
Charter and all that stuff. And there is a real departure right now, playing out in real time, of the US moving away from of that kind of notion of respecting sovereignty, respecting sort of fundamental rights of people.
In the 1980s and prior, like since World War II, countries have not always respected the human rights of people. And unfortunately, at times, especially in the context of the Cold War, we weren't always entirely opposed to the countries who were not respecting the human rights. But it feels next level to me that Trump kind of pals around with them. And Twitter and social media enable all of this. And this sort of hyper-mediazation atmosphere where the Argentine president comes and speaks at CPAC and Elon wields the chainsaw. And then what's Orban doing in Hungary? He doesn't like the EU, so maybe Trump likes him. This kind of palling around, if it's going on, there's a dignity of leadership that has been lacking, and that mostly, I guess, I would attribute to social media. Oh, let's all tweet at each other. No thanks. No thanks. The leader should be up here separate and maintain dignity.
The big distinction is that a lot of the support that was given to some regimes was all behind the scenes. It was secret. It
Yeah.
was clandestine. Right now, it's all out in the open, right? He's inviting the dictators to the US and sitting down and having press conferences with the dictators, right? That is different. That's some propaganda level stuff that's significantly different because when you invite the authoritarian leaders to the White House, you're giving them a platform on the world stage that they may not otherwise ever have, right? Because
Mhm.
the world is watching what the president says, what the president
Yeah.
does in a way that they don't necessarily watch the leaders of these smaller countries to the same degree, right? So Trump is effectively giving them access to a microphone and a megaphone that is way different. That we just haven't seen, and it is new and it's strange. But anyways, that's my last word. Is that we're living in
Mhm.
a strange sort of anti-democratic time of, and I don't mean anti-democratic like democratic politics, anti-democratic as in like the institutions of government of democracy that are reflected by the political will of the voters aren't being reflected in certain ways, specifically the institutions we put in place for human rights and for respecting human dignity. That has changed. And
Mhm.
you see a lot of pushback from the judiciary in particular about this, with all those judges saying, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. And the big departure is that the administration isn't agreeing with the judiciary on certain things. When you have Stephen Miller coming out and saying, "Oh, let's just get rid of habeas corpus," right? That hasn't happened since Lincoln, right? They tried with the Gitmo detainees, but even then, the Supreme Court said, "No, you still have habeas corpus, even if you're an enemy combatant, right? You still have the right to go to the court and say, why am I here? Under what legal authority are you keeping me detained?" And if they get rid of that, they're essentially expediting the removal of people way faster than we've ever seen. It's going to be super quick, like a conveyor belt. Just boom, goodbye everybody that they don't like. Americans are a little complacent. They don't quite understand how quick things can go really sour really fast. If the state has the power to remove people without any challenge, they'll just do it, and they'll do it really.
Yeah.
The U.S. has the capacity to do it really quickly. That if you look at the budget proposal, they want to add 20,000 more ICE agents. They want to increase the budget by 900% for ICE. That's going to be a lot of people in the streets getting snatched up and just shuffled somewhere, sent away somewhere, and who knows where, right? They have all these agreements with countries all over the place. Rwanda, they're trying for Libya, El Salvador. That's also just super weird, isn't it? I'm trying to think ever if the U.S. other than Gitmo, I guess the other example would be the black sites, but this is different because this is out in the open, and this is people who are being sent somewhere without actually being convicted of a crime. That's the big thing. It's not just, oh, this is a bad person, so they must go to the bad place. You have to prove that somebody's a bad person. You can't just say it. English common law, like going back to the Magna Carta, the king can't just say, that's a bad person, goodbye. I
Yeah.
have pulled the lever. They have now disappeared into the memory hole. I have
Mhm.
decided in my star chamber that they are guilty.
Mondays with Mike.